Well, good morning and welcome. My name is Mark Aaron. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and we warmly welcome and thank our panelists and journalists who are joining us for Campaign for President, the Manager's Look at 2020. For nearly 50 years, the Institute of Politics has brought together political advisors to write a first draft of history on each presidential election. We believe that some of the most important perspectives on politics come from the practitioners who've been serving on the front lines of campaigns, the campaign managers, senior advisors, pollsters, and other staffers who've been building the case, staying the course despite the ups and downs and twists and turns of the campaign trail, and all that that brings, both expected and unexpected, like the pandemic this year. And the pandemic has defined so much of the election, and as a result, it has in many ways defined our effort here today. For the first time in the IOP's history, we're conducting this convening virtually. But given the length and the various facets of the election cycle, including the global pandemic and the beginnings of a national racial reckoning, we have decided to give campaign advisors more time to discuss the general election than in previous convenings. We believe that splitting the moderated discussions into two larger separate panels will leave scholars and practitioners and historians and others with a more substantive and we hope accurate account of the election. Democratic managers and President Biden's advisors will speak about their efforts today, and we're in touch with members of former President Trump's team, and we hope can join us at a later date. As in the past, all details from these conversations are embargoed until the Institute of Politics releases materials from these sessions. The timing of that release will be announced later this summer, and everyone will be informed of that in advance. And as we've done since 1972, today's conversations will be transcribed into a book that we will publish later this year. Today, we're going to talk about everything: the historic field of candidates, the debates, the strategies, the convention, and much more. For those students who are joining us and asking a question, you're in for a real treat. As a reminder, nothing is off the table here for our journalists, but everything is off the record. In order for us to preserve the integrity of the process, everything we discuss will stay here. And we ask, and you've committed to not posting on social media, hence the embargo. After each session, the webinar will be ended. If you're invited back as a participant or as an observer, please log back at the assigned time using the same link. And last but not least, I want to thank our moderators today, Yamiche and Alex, David, Tolu, and Margaret, for their preparation and for the planning that they've placed into making these discussions so rich and important. This morning, Yamiche and Alex, we thank you so much for preparing for this. Alex is a member of our Senior Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics, for which we're grateful. So let's get started. Let me turn it over to Yamiche and Alex with my gratitude for their preparation, and to all the members of the Biden team for your commitment to this important and historic process. Thank you so much. Yamiche, Alex?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Alex and I are so excited to have this conversation. For almost half a century, Harvard's Institute of Politics has been hosting this event with campaign managers, and it is an honor for us to be here, even though it's not in person, to be here asking these questions. It was a wild campaign, and we're just so excited to dive right in. So we're going to dive right in. I want to say first, of course, thank you to Kate, Mike, Anita, Bruce, Steve, Cedric, and Simone for being here. We are going to try as best as possible to get to as many people as possible and to have as many questions posed as possible. So if you could try to wait for us to come to you, and also if you could try to keep your answers at least in the 1 to 2 minute range so that we can try to get to everyone. And not everyone will answer every question, but we'll try to direct questions to the people that we're talking to. So thanks so much for thinking about that. So I'm going to dive right in and go all the way back to November 2016. Former President Donald Trump wins the election.
Yeah.
Stunning. It was stunning. And I want to know from your point of view, how was President Biden, then of course, former Vice President Biden, thinking about that? Did he instantly know I need to run? Did he think Democrats had lost their way? Steve, if I could, maybe I'll start with you. Others can jump in.
Well, the answer to that is no. We weren't thinking about the next race at that time. In fact, everybody, I think, was absorbing the impact of what had just occurred. And I think it was fair to say all of us had invested time and effort and energy in Secretary Clinton's campaign. And to be honest with you, I think most of us expected that she would win. So at that point in time, it was just, significant kind of adjustment in our thinking and work on the transition right away in the vice president's office, and just recalibrating how we saw the future. We had already done quite a bit of work on exploring what the vice president's post-vice presidential life would look like. He had said to me really emphatically that all he really wanted to do in his post-vice presidential career was to do everything he has always been doing his whole life, to stay involved, to work on the issues that he had devoted his life and his public career to advancing. And that's really where our heads were at that time. And to be honest with you, we were just looking ahead and adjusting to the impact of what we had just seen.
Steve, can I just follow up on that for a second? The reference to his post-vice presidential activities. Can you talk a little bit about the limits that you may have put on what he would or wouldn't do to make sure that he didn't end up, 3 years later running for president with a whole bunch of speeches to Goldman Sachs hanging over his head, or a whole bunch of foreign income? Like, what were the boundaries of what he was going to do after leaving office?
They really were just, I think the parameters were established by the president at the time, the vice president, and then former vice president himself, which is just to maintain the integrity of his work, to stay concentrated on the things that he had always worked on in his career, especially obviously late in the vice presidency, the effort on the cancer moonshot, and really the creation of a domestic policy focused institute at the University of Delaware, and foreign policy, national security effort at the University of Pennsylvania, the Biden Cancer Institute, the Biden Foundation, which focused on an array of issues, including violence against women, that he had always been involved in, and just to maintain the character and the integrity of everything that he had done throughout his public career in his post-vice presidential life. That was really what we were devoted to. It was a very, in reality, a simple instruction. I just want to keep doing what I've always done, what I've devoted my life to, and can we help shape that as we're in this post-vice presidential phase of our lives? Can we shape that together and stay consistent with his values?
Okay. Mike, I want to ask you, in terms of the results from that election, President Biden spoke during that campaign and right after the 2016 campaign about his concern that Democrats were not showing enough respect and attention to working class voters. I wonder if you could just take us back to what kind of conversations you all were having in that period of November, December, January, just processing the reality that these historically Democratic constituencies had shifted away.
Well, I guess I would go back to the then vice president spent a lot of time campaigning for Secretary Clinton, and he had a clear sense that there was a problem. In fact, I believe the last event he did for Secretary Clinton, I believe, was in Northern Virginia, which might have been the night before, a couple nights before. I remember talking to him, and he had a real strong sense that she wasn't going to win. That he just felt that was kind of his feel for what was happening on the campaign.
How did he express that?
Well, that's what he said to me.
Oh.
He said, I don't, I'm worried here. I don't see the energy. I don't feel the energy. And I think there's a problem. Of course, he has, long experience. He will describe himself as a tactile politician, which of course presented particular issues in this election, given what he wasn't permitted to do. But that was his strong sense in 16. So I think he, certainly he hoped and he worked as hard as he could for a victory in 16, but I think he had a strong suspicion that it wasn't going to turn out that way. And he did have a real belief that, what we described in the 2020 campaign as a focus on rebuilding the backbone of America, that had not really been addressed as strong as it could have been in 16. And that was an important part of his thinking going forward. It was a central plank in his campaign. And, and some of that was a belief that he had that the backbone of the country wasn't feeling, I think the phrase, I'm trying to remember the phrase we used in some of the speeches, which is they weren't being heard and they weren't being respected. And that became that has long been sort of a part of who he is. And it was one of the central features of the campaign in 2020. So, I think he saw a problem, a bit of a hole in the messaging from the 16 effort, which, was, the 16 campaign had extraordinary dynamics for lots of different reasons, and extraordinary difficulty in terms of pressing any particular message. But that was his assessment, and he carried it with him. And that helped to inform, in part, what he did in his post-vice presidential years. As I think the Institute at the University of Pennsylvania was very much focused on foreign policy and national security. The Institute at the University of Delaware, which is what I helped run, was very much focused on domestic politics and issues. So I guess I'll be mindful of not going too long.
Mike, actually, if I could do a quick follow-up, which is, you said that he felt like things were not going in the right direction. Could you talk to us just a little bit more about what he told you about why that was and what the failings were?
Well, he didn't really get into that. He just get into a sense of his in a sense, his visceral or his real-time reaction to what he was feeling on the campaign. And, he has spoken about this. This isn't anything new. He has said at the time that he felt there was a concern about sort of speaking to, the concerns of working class Americans. And,
what is that? Would you say that was the candidate not speaking to working class, to working class Americans enough? Did he sense that it was that there was something else going on there?
I think he felt, look, I don't, I shouldn't necessarily, probably not a good idea for me to put words in Joe Biden's mouth, right? I won't be around much longer. No, I think he felt there was a dynamic in the 2016 campaign that overtook it, that really made it very difficult to have an issue-oriented debate, and that it became a real kind of maelstrom, which was hard to press a message in. I think he felt there was a real sort of, and look, you all lived it, I assume more than I did because I wasn't in the campaign, but there was a real dynamic in 16, which, just seemed to be hard to get to really the central issues that were at stake. And I think there's a lot of analysis done after the election that how little attention had actually been paid to specific issues. I forget, there were a couple of studies that were done after it. I forget who did it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where he would look to sort of an explanation for what happened.
Yeah. I want to bring in Anita here, and and let me know if this is the question for you, if you were there, maybe someone else was. But the president has said over and over again that Charlottesville was the thing that kind of moved him. Take us through that decision to run and his reaction in particular to Charlottesville. Was he there? Did he see the video of Heather Heyer dying when that man, that white supremacist, drove into that crowd of protesters? Talk to us specifically about the president's reaction.
So this is a better question for Mike and Steve and Kate Bedingfield. I was not that involved with the operation at the time, so I would kick it over to one of them, probably
Kate?
Mike.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna. Well, Kate, were you there? Or if not, Mike can take it. But
Hi, I'm so sorry. My computer picked this moment to break out. I'm sorry. What was the question?
My question was about the president's reaction specifically to Charlottesville, to the death of Heather Heyer. He said that that's the reason why he ran. I want to know about that moment when he learned about Charlottesville, and also when he learned about former President Trump saying both sides. But I really wanted to take us into that moment where the car kills this woman as she's protesting white supremacy.
Yeah, he was horrified. I remember calling him that afternoon just to tell him what was going on, and he said he was already watching, that he was horrified, that he he had spoken a lot, I think, as we're kind of, as Steve and Mike were talking about the period post vice presidency, I remember him really wanting to speak to the kind of fundamental way that Trump was tearing at our institutions and the fabric of the nation. I mean, I think he really identified kind of, beyond the sort of coarseness and the shock value that Trump was bringing to our politics. I think President Biden really zeroed in on what he viewed as the larger existential threat. And so for him, my sense in talking to him that day about Charlottesville was, that he really viewed this as a very stark encapsulation of just how dangerous a threat Trump posed to the country. He was obviously I mean, he was I just remember him being very very animated and outraged, and he wanted to speak, he wanted to say something, and that ultimately led to the opinion piece, the op-ed. But he was very clear that day in that first conversation that I remember having with him about it, that he wanted his voice to be heard on this.
Did he immediately know? Oh, I think we're both asking the same question, which is, did he immediately know that he wanted to run, or how long after that Charlottesville incident did he say, "Yeah, this is real"? I know that when he announced, but if you could take us through the actual decision and how close after Charlottesville that was made.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly not a conversation we had that day. I think for him, it was a motivating moment. It was sort of a spark that really, for him, he felt like this can't be our country. This can't be the United States of America. And if there's any role that I can play in trying to bring us back from this place, back off from this path that we're going down, then it's my obligation to do that. This was not a conversation that we had that day. This, I think, sort of germinated over the course of the following weeks and months even. But he really viewed this as a point of no return in some ways, in terms of what Trump was doing to really tear at the fabric of our society. So this was a very it was a very powerful moment to him, and as he said publicly many times, it was really the thing that made him feel like this was his obligation.
Congressman Richmond, I want to bring you in here and sort of move the timeline forward a little bit to sort of the winter of 2018 or early spring of 2019, when President Biden is getting ready to actually get into this race. I wonder what advice you gave him about just sort of how to think about the state of the Democratic Party at that point, and what did he want to know from you about the sort of the conversation on the Hill, what perhaps a younger generation of lawmakers in the chamber and around the country were looking to see from him in this race?
Well, to answer that, I probably need to back up a moment from when you all just talked to Kate and Mike and Anita. After the midterms, maybe right before the midterms, the only thing I was focused on was trying to figure out a way to win the House back, because we had to stop Donald Trump. And I didn't know President Biden that well. And I went to President Biden, Vice President Biden, and former Vice President, and asked him to help because I know he was a popular figure. I know he was somebody that people trusted, and he would shoot it straight to people. So I asked him, would he come out and get involved in a bunch of races that I was involved in, trying to help us win back the House? And he did it. And he, you know, out of all the races he participated in, we probably won about 90% of them. And he was so engaged that as soon as the race was over, and look, I am new to Biden world, didn't really know him that well. I had a sense of his heart, but I didn't know him. And when that was over, I think I called after then and said, you have to do this. And he was like, well, no, I don't think I do. If anybody else can win the Democratic primary, I don't feel compelled that it has to be me.
Sorry, this was after the 2018 election?
This was after the 2018. He said if somebody would give me, I think his words were, somebody would give me the Democratic primary right now, I would decline it. I think we have a talented bench and we can beat Donald Trump. But if I get the sense that we can't, then maybe I'm interested. So the difference between, I think, me and everybody else on the phone, I was actively trying to court him to run, because I knew we needed somebody who stood for principle, who people respected, who was unapologetically honest. And so that's kind of where I came. And then, so it was never him courting me to say, oh, Cedric, I want to run for president. I need you with me. You know, I'd love to be that important, but I'm just not. And so it was me saying, you have to do this. And then Mike may remember, or Steve, then he got into this weird game of, you know, maybe I'm 60% going. And all the way up to announcement, he and I kept going with this percentage game. But after Charlottesville, I had a good sense that he was running, even if he didn't. I mean, at some point he was like, oh, Cedric, I'm 83% there. And I was like, what the hell is that?
Did the number ever tick back down once it was going up? Was it like 90 one day, 77 the next?
No, it never ticked back down.
Never ticked back down.
Because I think there was just a drumbeat of people, and it started to be a snowball effect, that people realized that we really needed him. And I was chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. I had 2 Black Caucus members that I knew were getting in the race, both Harris and Booker. But there was something about Biden, and I, you know, still don't know really exactly what it was, but I just knew that he was honest, and this was all about people as opposed to being about him and his ego and wanting to be president. And the fact that he didn't want to run was very interesting to me, because he was more concerned about the party than about him.
Can I just ask you real fast, when you said there was a sense that you needed Biden, how much, you know, for someone like yourself and your colleagues in the House, was there a sense that we need Biden, because if we don't get Biden, we're going to get somebody too far left to win this thing?
Well, I always thought that. And it had nothing to do with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus. It had everything to do with my son. I knew that I didn't want my son to grow up in a world where Donald Trump was president for 8 years, because it'd be a different world. It'd be a less tolerant world. It would be a bad country. And so I did it in a selfish way, because I have a family that I really love and appreciate. And so in my heart, I thought that former Vice President Biden was the only one that can win. And then the strange thing is I really got to know him. And, you know, I really respected him and thought a lot of him. And I thought that he would be the right person at the right time to unite the country. So I just, you know, I wasn't in Biden world. I didn't know Mike very well. I think I remember our first time meeting, and Steve. But my whole thing was I was recruiting him from day one. And then he came down to New Orleans on his book tour and came play golf with my, you know, older Black golfers on the public course. And when I saw him and I saw how he interacted and I saw how he asked them about their life stories, not about his, I was like, he's the one, he has to run. So kind of happened.
And a quick follow-up to Cedric, because maybe this won't be that quick of an answer, but I kind of, as I was hearing you talking, I wonder, how did race play into this? you said that he was the one that had to run. I wonder how that factored into the idea of picking or of wanting President Joe Biden to run when there was this real talk about the Democratic Party needing to have a person of color, needing to have a woman. How much did that factor into your decision to say, no, we really need Joe Biden?
Well, I thought we really needed to win. And I thought we really needed a person of character and principle. And look, I thought that Booker and Harris were both that. But I looked at the country as it was, not as I wanted it to be. And the country that elected Donald Trump, I thought was a different country than I'd ever seen before. And that made me make different decisions. But once I started recruiting Vice President Biden, in my mind, so remember, this is two different tracks. Former Vice President Biden probably had his own inner circle then. I wasn't in it. I was just a congressman saying, we need you to run for the sake of the country. And I still stand behind it. I still believe he's the only person that could win. But I also think more than that, and it's not just about winning sometimes, I think he was the right person at the right time to do this. I don't think anybody else could do what he was doing because they didn't have the credibility. So I was more on a recruitment tour like a college coach. And I just really thought we needed him. And race didn't play a factor into it. My little son at the time, and everybody knows my world revolves around my son. My son didn't care if the president was black or white. My son cared that he has a world that he could live in that's tolerant and loving. And so that's how I did it.
Mm-hmm. If there's anybody else that was really engaged in I guess at the early part of this, I wonder if there was anyone else who would comment about the idea that he was going to be an older white man running for office. Not to say that would stop him, but that race would be a calculation.
So, Yamiche, it's Anita. I think that Kate and I spent a lot of time during this period talking to reporters who certainly felt that was the case. And I would just make a few points about sort of what the press and political insiders and sort of the prevailing conventional wisdom in the Democratic Party was coming out of 2018, because it was, we thought, absolutely wrong in terms of, who the right candidate was to beat Donald Trump. But there certainly was this, former Vice President Biden campaigned across the country for congressional candidates in 2018. And he came out of 2018 seeing that candidates won on the ACA, on healthcare, that we had picked up a lot of marginal districts and suburban Republican districts with candidates who, were running strongly on, the ACA, and were running not from the far left of the party, but from more of the center of the party. A lot of the professional political class in the Democratic Party ignored that in the general election and focused very much on one congressional race, very low turnout primary in Queens, New York, and decided that was actually where the Democratic Party needed to go. So, I think that Kate and I'm looking at Kate because we spend a lot of time talking to reporters about this issue you've raised about was he too old.
Anita, can I just ask you? Can I just jump in on the one congressional district in Queens? Because I was one of the reporters who asked you these questions. I completely agree that the notion that the party had sort of veered far left in the midterms was always overblown. But there was a lot of evidence from the primaries that year. The Democratic primary voters were gravitating particularly towards women, right? And I wonder how much that was a factor in sort of the way you were thinking about the path for him.
Well, I would, I might push back on that suggestion, Alex, just in terms of, you look at gubernatorial primaries, and I think it was a great year for women. It was the best year for women since the original year of the woman back in 1992. It was actually better. So it was exciting for everyone. But I think that the gender piece of this was not as important at the end of the day as sort of where people were on the spectrum. And if you looked at the gubernatorial primaries in particular, which was something I looked very carefully at in key states we needed to take back in the general election, Wisconsin, Michigan, you know, what you saw were that the candidates who won were not the far left candidates, but they were the more centrist candidates, whether they were women like Gretchen Whitmer or men like Tony Evers. So I think that coming out of 2018, certainly based on his own experience campaigning for candidates, then former Vice President Biden felt pretty strongly about where the gravity in the party was, but it was at odds with, it was very much at odds with sort of where the conventional wisdom in the political class was about what kind of candidate the Democrats needed to nominate in order to win.
I think it's also worth, the only thing I would also add to this conversation is I think it's also worth remembering how extraordinary a time and a moment this was, and what Trump was doing to our politics and to the country. And there's a certain, this is something obviously reporters do, and the professional political class, there's a certain academic interest in analyzing, where did, how did women fare this year? And, how did supposed centrist candidates versus more liberal candidates fare? But, that's always a little bit detached from what people are actually living and feeling in their day-to-day lives. And I think what was missed in that academic exercise that we were all going through together in 2018 and 2019 was just how powerfully people were looking for Biden's message. They were looking for somebody who was identifying the threat, who was talking about it in a way that resonated in their lives, that people felt like he understood what the Trump presidency was missing about what was going on in their lives. And somebody who brought a sense of civility and dignity to politics. And I think it's easy for us to sort of, get pulled off of that as we kind of look back and crunch through the data and look at where the prevailing sort of demographics were at the time. I think doing that without appreciating how effectively Biden was communicating exactly what people were feeling, and that the trust that they put in him, that was something that I think was kind of missing. And that's, I think, part of why the press narrative around whether he was the right candidate or not was so off the mark. Because I think, I think that piece was missing.
I'd just like to say 30 seconds more about that. There was the vice president, I think, was strongly defined in the public's mind in terms of his character, his integrity, his decency. People believed, he was an honest person, in a difficult business. And I think, the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony with President Obama, their partnership in those 8 years, the way that he worked, the way that he carried himself through difficulty, the resiliency, the dignity which he displayed through the toughest, most difficult personal times, that wasn't a 2018 phenomenon. That was on display his entire career. And he brought that to this race. And that was a strong, important foundation for everything, absolutely everything he did. And Mike and Kate, Anita, and a number of us worked with him in 2015 and 2016. But again, just fundamental to everything important about this race and what occurred all along the way was just a sense of Joe Biden's character, his decency, his integrity. And I think that was really foundational.
Yeah, I think what Steve is saying is so important, because oftentimes throughout the course of the primary, the media and, I know folks don't like to be referred to as the media, but it's true. The media, press and reporters, particularly national reporters, would be reporting on one thing. And then we would be in a small town in South Carolina, a small town in Iowa, somewhere in Nevada. And if you juxtapose the headlines and the front pages of the local newspapers with what the national newspapers were saying at the time, you would think all these reporters came to two totally different events. And so what people were reading and watching in their hometowns, they were hearing on the radio, was being covered differently. They felt like they knew Joe Biden. The hometown papers and reporters, from my perspective, were really capturing what people in these communities wanted to hear about and wanted to know about, while in many national headlines, national reporters were focused on the gaffes.
Can I ask you, Simone, not on gaffes, but there was that period at the very beginning of the race, right, when he comes in as the strong front runner, or at least a clear front runner. He takes a whole lot of incoming on, his physical manner campaigning, on the Hyde Amendment, on his record, dating back decades in the Senate. It was reported at the time that you were a really important voice in sort of talking him through, some of the subjects where, like, his positions on stuff like the Hyde Amendment had been totally mainstream for Democrats.
Let's be clear about the Hyde Amendment, because I think there is a lot of confusion and consternation when I think at the time, then Vice President Biden was clear, and we've all repeated it, but let's repeat it one more again. Particularly when it comes to the Hyde Amendment, the way then Vice President Biden was looking at it, and I think Anita and Kate will reiterate this here, was that he was looking at this through the lens of his healthcare plan. And as he was having conversations and deciding what his healthcare plan would look like, how it would affect working people across the country, poor people, he really felt as though that he couldn't talk about a healthcare plan that benefited working people across the country, families, women, poor people. And there was a provision that existed that would lock out a number of poor women, disproportionately women of color, from healthcare access. So that's what the Hyde Amendment really was about for him. And I think what voters appreciated about then Vice President Biden, and frankly, what the American people appreciate about President Biden now, is that they know that he is true to what he believes. He is staunch in his convictions. He's not someone that is a piece of paper that flows where the wind flows. Sure. He's very much so rooted in what he believes. And if at any given time he is saying something different, he has a clear reason and a conviction on why that is.
Can I just ask you, though, in that period, and I totally get everything you just said, in that run up to the first debate, though, when he is taking so much incoming from national press, from other, I guess, more Democratic advocacy groups than actually other Democratic candidates in the race, what's your most vivid memory of him turning to you and asking for advice, or turning to you and saying, well, shit, it's getting hot out there?
I mean, I guess I would say that the vice president always knew that he would take some incoming. That's what happens when you're the proverbial front runner in the race. But, he's not sitting around, or was never sitting around stewing or thinking about the attacks that were being lobbed on him in the media and the press. This was really for him about focus on people, on families. And I think if you look at him throughout the course of the primary campaign and into the general, he was extremely disciplined in his message. When I first sat down with then Vice President Biden, he told me about the battle for the soul of the nation, and that we have to, and breaking that down and what that meant about working class people, middle class families, reasserting ourselves on the world stage. And I think that consistency was key to weather any of the storms that were lobbed against him. So in the lead up, in that run up to the first debate, it was getting hot, but Joe Biden was saying the same thing.
I want to bring in Bruce here. There was that first debate, June 27th, 2019. Who did you think was going to attack now President Biden? Who did you think was your competition? And of course, was he surprised by that attack from now Vice President Harris?
Well, I'm sure he was surprised by the nature of the attack. He was the front runner. He knew he was going to take a lot of punches, it was an enormous field. Remember, we had candidate after candidate who'd take a shot at him, and some of them, wouldn't be there the next debate. But he didn't worry about that. Sorry about the dog in the background.
Very 2021. Go ahead.
I think, yeah. I think that, before we get too far into the primaries, there's one more thing to say that, and to build on what others have pointed out, is Joe Biden's never been a creature of the conventional wisdom. It's always been one of his great strengths. He never went Washington. He didn't live in Washington until he became vice president. He's very rooted in where he came from. The press annoys him from time to time, but it never had much impact on what he thought. And that was a great, in a time like this, to have your own compass that you follow with all of the ups and downs that any campaign is going to have, was a real strength for him. And it was like, for him, running was, the decision to run wasn't an ideological decision or a political decision. It was really a personal decision. Like he'd run before. He didn't need to be president. As Cedric said, he didn't particularly want to be president. Even when he was vice president, there were plenty of times when he, said right out that he didn't envy President Obama, the decisions he had to make. And his family had been through a lot. He'd been through a lot. He was, they were all trying to find that moment when, the memory of Bo would bring a smile to the lips before a tear to the eye. That it's true for anyone that it has, it's ultimately a personal decision, but that was especially true for Joe Biden, who wouldn't do anything to hurt his family, knew what he was in for from the other side, and was the furthest possible from Dick Nixon plotting on the sidelines of trying to figure out when he could, get back in the game. He was a happy, scrappy, but reluctant lawyer.
And Mike, I want to bring you in. It's been reported that it was hard to overstate the bad blood between the Harris campaign and the Biden campaign after that first debate. Can you talk a bit more about that first debate? Was the president surprised by Harris's attack? Tell us more about what that was like for him and whether or not if he at all thought that this was going to happen.
Well, he was surprised. He wasn't surprised he was going to get attacked. But this notion of bad blood, I think, is overblown. I mean, if you've worked with Joe Biden for any amount of time, one of the things you realize is he has an incredible capacity to go past these things. And he did. And ultimately, he picked Vice President Harris. So one of the things that was hard for him in the primary debates was it was hard for him to be fighting with other Democrats. It's not what he wanted to do.
But on busing in particular, on obviously Bo and Vice President Harris had been friends. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about that first debate.
Yes, he was surprised, and obviously, he knew the relationship between Vice President Harris and Bo. The answer I can give is pretty straightforward, which is he moved past it really fast. That's what he did, and he moved past it to the point where he picked Vice President Harris because he thought she'd be the best candidate. So, but I want to go back to something that Bruce was saying, because I don't think we focused enough on this, which is, in campaigns, there's always an enormous amount of focus on things like, well, what lane are you going to operate in? And in a series of decisions that campaigns make, like, who are you going to hire to run it, and can you raise money, and do you have an organizational structure, and all these kinds of things. In my view, it all misses the mark. And it misses the mark for this reason, which is, in my view, every presidential campaign is won or lost with the very first decision you make, which is, what is it about? Why are you doing it? And the problem that most campaigns have is they never reach with any clarity an answer to that question. And so, you go back, some folks raised Charlottesville earlier. Charlottesville was the reason Joe Biden ran for president. Okay, Kate mentioned what happened, right? I remember right after it happened, he called me and he said, I have to speak on this. Okay, and then what followed was the article that appeared in the Atlantic. And that, in my view, became the foundational document for the Biden for president campaign.
Can I just ask?
Let me just say that he had absolute clarity about why he was in.
Yep.
Right, and he was in because he fundamentally believed there was a battle for the soul of this country. right? And look, that wasn't something that came from someone else. It certainly wasn't poll driven. In fact, every pollster who talked to him told him not to do it. Yeah. Right. And
because it was vague or what? Because it was vague. What were the pollsters saying?
Because they felt it was vague. Because they felt the campaign should be almost exclusively focused on debate about the middle class, because philosophy, because they felt it needed to be more specific around issues. But it didn't matter.
Mike, they also did not think it should be a campaign about Trump. Many of them had talked to us.
And that, of course, was another conventional wisdom right at the time, which was that, people came out 18 and 16 and said, well, too much attention paid to Trump.
Right.
And, if you go back to the announcement video, the campaign was very much focused on the threat that Trump was posing. My point is this, though, is that presidential campaigns, in my view, they make that first decision. And you have to make the first decision, which is what is it about, and state it with clarity. And then have the conviction to stick with it with discipline through the end. Okay? And he did that. He's one of the few campaigns you can look at where the first speech he gave is pretty consistent with the last piece. But we all get into this other conversation. And what's missing when we don't look at the first decision is, first of all, does the candidate come to a point of clarity? And then secondly, is that person in that message at that moment in time what the country needs? And I thought there was a pretty overwhelming argument that Joe Biden was the best candidate for the moment. And it was dismissed almost immediately. And it got into a whole conversation about, is he too old? And can he raise money? Right. And all these other factors. And it's just a whole different conversation with the voters.
Okay.
I mean, for example, one of the things that voters ask all the time that never gets asked in the press is, who do you want to be president?
Right.
Do you think they can do the job? Right. And so anyway, we've gone through, I don't know, almost an hour. And to me, it's that very first moment that matters the most. Okay. And the truth is, I've been in a lot of these campaigns. A lot of campaigns never make that first decision.
I want to go to
campaign.
Mike, I'm sorry to cut you off a little bit here, but you're right. We have been going almost an hour, and we're only in like July. So I do want to sort of fast forward the timeline a little bit and ask Anita on the same theme. By the time you get to September, October, who, in your view, at that point, of the other candidates in the race, has answered the question of why are you running with sufficient clarity that, you know what, they're a formidable competitor in this race, that, we don't think that the voters want what they're selling, but they're selling something that is clear and consistent with who they are?
There's no question that in both the 2016 campaign and in the 2020 campaign, Senator Sanders had a clear message about who he was, why he was running. There was no question about it. It is remarkable how consistent his message is. I say, if you look at Joe Biden and you look at Bernie Sanders, they were the two candidates whose messages were the most consistent. And you can go back and look at, YouTube videos of Senator Sanders when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont. Right. And it's a very consistent message. So no question he had a strong sense of who he was, why he was running, and a clear message about it. Now, we didn't think it was, obviously we thought Joe Biden's sort of sense of where the country was, as Mike said, the right person at the right moment for where the country was, and to actually be the strongest candidate to defeat Donald Trump, not because of polls, which, but because of who he was and the contrast he made. But there was no question that we, I think from day one of this campaign knew that if it boiled down to a two-person race, it would probably be against Senator Sanders.
Did anybody else ever strike you as like clearly threatening to break into that, if it's a two-person race, it could actually come down to us and insert other candidate here?
Listen, this was one of the most extraordinarily talented fields of people. I think that if you look at, if you just look at the people who started this race, and there were 23 or 24 at the beginning, and we had at least 3 debates, I think, that were 10 and 10. So, you have really talented, great Democratic Party leadership running for the presidency in a way that was unprecedented. In 1988, people thought the field was big. In 2008, people thought the field was big, and we had what, 8 or 9 people at the first debate, I think. So, so I think, certainly you can make the case for many of the candidates who were on that stage at the beginning. And, obviously once Mayor Bloomberg got in and started spending, a couple dollars here and there, you could see where potentially he could, be a viable candidate. But at the end of the day, in terms of just clarity of message and sense of where they wanted to lead the country, I think the two candidates with the clearest messages were Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. But you could have seen any number of those candidates getting to the final two. I think and just building on what Mike said, but something that I think really was important was that he understood, I think in a way that most people did not, that the choice in this election was going to come down to what kind of country people wanted their children to grow up in, and that it was a battle for the soul of the nation and not just a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. And I think that was a big difference.
I want to, because you mentioned the former mayor of New York, I want to ask Steve, I believe it was in a phone call to you from one of Bloomberg's aides that they notified you that he was getting into the race. He was going back on his word to make way for Vice President Biden, and he was going to get it, and he was going to self-fund a campaign. Tell us about learning that, your reaction in that moment, like how seriously or how alarming was that?
I don't think we considered it alarming. And as Anita just said, and everybody's alluded to, it was a very strong field and a bunch of strong people in the race who were, we had multiple strategies to compete with. We had a variety of kind of political narratives that we had to combat all along the way. And I don't think it was, a huge surprise that Mayor Bloomberg was going to take a look at the race along the way. He had a friendship with the vice president that was many years long. And so again, I don't think interestingly, and again, this cuts against part of a press narrative of how this goes. I think we, as Mike underscored, had a sense of the kind of campaign and the person, the human being who the vice president was that we wanted to run. And we just stuck with it from, really the very first speech and built on this sense of who the vice president was. And it wasn't him against Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or Michael Bloomberg or anyone. It was defining who he was, his vision for the country. We believed in this argument that we were in a battle for the soul of America. Ultimately, it was a competition between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And we thought he was the best candidate and had the strongest potential to win that race against Donald Trump. The truth of the matter was, I think at the time the vice president believed he had a close personal relationship with many of the other candidates in the field. And, again, with him, all politics is personal. And I think it was just on a human level for him. It was more about advancing his own argument, making the case for his vision for the country, more than every one of these internecine battles along the way in a campaign, including Mayor Bloomberg's entry into the race.
Well, Alex, let me just say, I'm not from Biden, but I was a congressman, so I do get to have a different view every once in a while. I was livid when Bloomberg got in the race because it was, I'm the only one that can do this. Biden's not good enough. I have a bunch of money. I'm going to spend it with a bunch of mayors. I'm going to buy the campaign. It was intellectually dishonest, in my opinion. And I thought it was a slap directly at former Vice President Biden. And when I watched it and saw it coming, it was all about, I think I have a lane and an opportunity to go buy this race. And so the campaign never discussed it, but as a guy sitting in Congress and a guy who is with Biden because I'm worried about the future of this country, I did not like the fact, and I still don't like the fact, that a guy got in this race, not on principle, not on agenda, but because he thought he could win. And
did you ever say to your colleagues who were endorsing him, like exactly what you just said? Like, what are you thinking?
I don't remember any of my colleagues endorsing him. Mayors
he got a bunch, but yeah. But tell us about the mayors.
The mayors around the country. You know, he was the third form of government for a bunch of mayors around the country. He did some good work in cities. I will not discount that. He was actually putting his money where value should go in cities across the country. That doesn't mean you're a great candidate for president. But when he entered, how he entered was, I believe, a direct shot at the Democratic Party. And I think he paid a toll for it. And I think that, you know, Senator Warren exposed it. It was easy to expose. You know, I never thought it was, I don't want to say genuine, but I just thought it was opportunistic. And I thought it was a direct slap at the vice president of the United States, former vice president, and the team he had assembled around him. And I took it personal then. I still take it personal now, if you can't tell.
Cedric, if I could stick on this theme of being livid and possibly opportunistic, this idea that we saw then former President Trump trying to use this Hunter Ukraine drama against then Vice President Biden. What was your reaction to that? Was there any concern that it would be used by other Democratic candidates? We saw Pete Buttigieg, of course, come to the president's defense at a debate, but I wonder if you could also talk about that.
Well, I was dual role here. I was on judiciary. I was smack dab in impeachment. And if we're talking about intellectually dishonest or just smack dumb, you saw the Republicans on judiciary try to change the narrative to Vice President Biden and Hunter Biden. And then you saw all of these national security and all these honest people come up and said, whoa, Vice President Biden did what he was supposed to do. And I didn't think a Democrat was dumb enough to take that bait and to attack a guy who's lived his life the way that Vice President Biden did. And Pete came to his defense. And I think many Democrats were like, we're not going to take that bait because this is a red herring. This guy's a threat to the country. You could not be any clearer in impeachment than the evidence that was presented. And we just had to sit there. Any Democrat that was dumb enough to align themselves with Matt Gaetz and Jim Jordan, I thought would just self-destruct, and nobody did it. And I think part of it was because of the character and the record of former Vice President Biden, and that people just did not buy anything along those lines.
And Jen O'Malley, thank you so much, Cedric. Jen O'Malley Dillon has joined us. Jen, you're here, right? Correct? I think you're here.
I'm here. Hi,
okay,
can you see me?
Great. Yes, and I can hear you. So Jen, I want to fast forward to the Iowa caucuses. It was a bit of a fiasco. Talk about what that meant. It was reported at the time that a campaign aide, unnamed, said this was a gift. Talk about the impact of what Iowa meant for the campaign.
Well, look, I think all these guys that you've been talking to can speak to Iowa a lot better since, I wasn't there. I obviously have a long history of seeing Iowa. From the outside, I really felt like, that what the campaign was doing, the ads that they were running, the message that he was delivering was exactly what I thought the American people wanted and wanted to hear and needed to hear. So I actually felt like the strategy and the voice and the message was incredibly strong, but I'll let these guys speak more to the caucus itself and, how they navigated that. But, at the end of the day, the campaign was very clear about the importance of, the states, the diversity of the states coming up further into the primary process. We had a number of candidates across the board. So I think their strategy was actually quite strong in really being clear that this wasn't going to be a one and done thing, regardless of how it turned out, and that it was really important to think about where this country is heading, taking on Trump, and who is ultimately going to be voting across the country, which was, far more when we were getting to Nevada and South Carolina. And clearly that proved to be true.
And for someone who was on the campaign, they weigh in and also take us through Nevada. How important was that second place finish?
So I will jump in here then. I would say, first of all, the Iowa caucus was, could have been better organized. I think that Mike during the summer had gotten a little flack from somebody by saying that the campaign did not need to come in first in Iowa in order to win the nomination, but he was absolutely right. And our theory of the case had been that the first 4 states, that somebody would emerge from the first 4 states, or a couple of candidates would emerge from the first 4, but that Iowa and New Hampshire should not get to pick the nominee. And that in a party that was really looking at itself and looking at issues of diversity and broadening our coalition, that the idea that we're going to let Iowa and New Hampshire, which are not very diverse states, where Iowa in particular, I am not a big believer in caucuses. I think they're very undemocratic. So that idea that you were going to let them pick the nominee was just wrong, and that you needed to include Nevada and South Carolina.
Anita, can I just ask you on that? Like, was there a conversation at any point? Because you guys really ran through the tape in Iowa, right? Despite the factors that you just described. Was there ever any conversation about like, this is stupid. Like, we're spending so much time and money in a state which is like a bunch of white people voting in this like arcane, ridiculous process?
There was, I think there was an
I see some smiles here.
Yeah, so there was an ongoing conversation, but at the same time, I think ultimately the team decided, and I think, and this was obviously the candidate's decision, that as the, as the former vice president, as somebody who sort of had his position in the party and was the front runner, that we couldn't skip the state. It's only been successfully skipped a couple of times in Democratic Party history. And that was when Tom Harkin was a candidate, which gave a big permission slip to everybody to not have to compete there in 1992 when Bill Clinton was running. So, we always knew that South Carolina, of the first 4, was our must win, and was the priority state. We felt we would do better in Nevada. And that was a very competitive state for us, although it was a caucus, which was never as great for us. And that Iowa and New Hampshire were going to be very problematic. And so we did feel what we had to do was look like we were viable coming out of those 2 states.
Yeah,
So
Alex, there was conversation about whether to spend in Iowa, especially given the fact that, we forget it now, having raised and spent $1.69 billion, that at the time the campaign had very little money. And so there was a debate about it. Okay, my view was, and I think a lot of folks shared the view that you don't get the choice, that you got to play the schedule, and especially if you're the former vice president of the United States.
And Mike, just to clarify what I think you and Anita basically just said, but that was President Biden's view himself.
Yeah, his view as well. But here's the thing that I don't think is, now we, as we go through kind of describing it, it was a really hard time for Joe Biden. Okay, he was getting pummeled. Right? He was the former vice president of the United States. Right? There was no gift coming out of Iowa. No one was confused about what happened in Iowa, even though the results were, a bit of a mess.
Right? Mike, hold on. While you finish, I still think we won Iowa. The results are still coming in. Go ahead.
But here's the thing that people underestimate, I think, how steady Joe Biden was through that fight. Okay, he was just getting pummeled, right? The absolute article of faith was, it is over. Your money's drying up. You're going home, right? Once you lose Iowa and New Hampshire, it's over. And he really hung in there. He had faith in what he was doing. To this day, he'll tell you he never believed he wasn't going to win. But it was a really hard, difficult time. And
was there a lowest point?
Oh, look, you could probably take, the night of the caucus on through to pretty much South Carolina as a pretty consistent, really tough time.
I mean,
come on.
a conversation in your mind that illuminates how tough this was and how low this
Well,
got.
no, just look, being on a bus with him in Iowa and New Hampshire and seeing him going to events, and they're not really well attended. And every time you pick up the paper and every time you turn on the news, someone else is telling you it's over, right? You spent, 40 plus years in politics. You've been the vice president of the United States. And he hung in there, and he never lost faith in what he was saying and why he was in the race. And it goes back to my earlier point, which is to get through that, you have to have a really strong degree of conviction and a real faith in what you're saying. And you have to believe it's worth saying no matter what's going to happen. But no one should underestimate how hard it was for him to live through those months, because it was hard. And there wasn't a lot of belief that come South Carolina, it's all going to turn, and it's all going to turn in a matter of 3 days, right? That was not. So if you were with Joe Biden in that period of time, as I was and folks here were, I think you walked away with, everyone talks about how resilient it is, how tough he is in the face of really tough things. And look, he's faced tougher things than Iowa and New Hampshire, or, with in his own life. But he demonstrated to me an incredible degree of strength in a really tough period of time, in faith, in a message, in a campaign, when there was virtually zero external affirmation to do. And I don't think, that's not easy to get through, so.
I'd argue the night the power went out in the hotel in Nashua between Iowa and New Hampshire was really a symbolic.
That seemed to have a message, a bigger message. Yes.
Faith sees best in the dark.
Kate, I was going to say you could pick almost any day between the Iowa caucus and South Carolina, and it could be the worst day. But no, actually, once we got to South Carolina, first of all, I want to. Jen is now on here, so I can only say that Jen's agreement to go to Nevada as a volunteer, but what we called a super volunteer, and help with the organization there and to help us with the caucus there was significant. And our coming in second in Nevada was significant. And once we got to South Carolina, and I have to say Simone, who had been decamped to South Carolina a couple of weeks before and basically told that she
living there
couldn't leave the state. Yeah. So, we had at that point basically taken all of our very scanty resources and put them into Nevada and South Carolina, because we did have a candidate who had the right message. We did believe that we could get to the more diverse states, if we could get out of New Hampshire with some degree of viability, which, as Mike says, nobody but us really believed we had at that point. But that he carried this campaign. I've worked on winning campaigns. I've worked on losing campaigns. Usually when campaigns start losing, it becomes a very vicious cycle and a very accelerating vicious cycle down, in which everything goes wrong. And Joe Biden carried his campaign with his strength and his resilience and his refusal to lose. His absolute refusal to lose in the face of everybody telling him he'd already lost. And once we got to South Carolina, you could just feel the difference with the crowds, with just the overall atmosphere. And even though I think there were people who continued to believe that we couldn't win the state, there was never any question we were going to win. It was just a question of what the margin was going to be. And
I want to go to Jen now, and unfortunately skip sort of substantially ahead here because we're really short on the clock. Jen, can you tell us a little bit about just sort of taking over the campaign as essentially the public component of the campaign ground to a halt? What are the decisions that have to get made first about just how you proceed with contesting what was, almost a general election at that point when, you can't leave the house?
Yeah, it's weird being back in the attic, but I felt like, I needed to do this from here. I mean, I think one of the things that's really important to say is in any presidential campaign, even if you're not changing staff components, what you're trying to accomplish in the general election is very different than what your structure and your strategy is for the primary. It's not different for the candidate. It's not different for the message and the vision. And as Mike says, you know, we had the main ingredients that are most important. The structure and the campaign is sort of just around that to support the kind of main ingredients. But you have to build a very different campaign because you are running on a massive playing field. Instead of going from one primary to the next, you're playing, you know, across 20 plus states as we were. You have to build for the components that you need to take on a general election candidate, one party, as opposed to what we were doing in the primary. So fundamentally, you're going to go through that exercise. And at the same time, we obviously hit at that exact moment COVID. And, you know, I would say it was hard, of course, but we really didn't know what it meant for the long term. So it wasn't like, you know, when we shut down, we shut down, it was my first day, we shut down, we said, we're going to do it for 2 weeks and we're going to reevaluate. And we really thought.
Can you just tell us, like, just in a little bit more detail about that specific moment where, like, who's in that conversation? What's President Biden's reaction? Is it his decision? Is it your recommendation to him that he approves that, like, yeah, shut it down?
Yeah, I mean, he said from the very beginning, we need to make sure that we are not only keeping people safe, but we are serving as role models on the campaign and him himself to make decisions that are based on science and based on what the guidelines we're getting from experts in cities and states and what we need to be doing here, regardless of what Trump was doing. That was our North Star. And he really said that clearly. He wanted to make sure that we were putting no one in harm's way, but we were also representing how we should be acting and how everyone in the country should be looking at us to see that we're following those guidelines. And so that was like number one. And that made it really easy in the context to know that we were pulling down events, we were stopping travel, you know, we were thinking about very specifically, you know, that final debate with Bernie and, you know, do you do an elbow bump? Do you know, not? I mean, those were like really early stages of how you engage with people. And he really wanted to make sure no matter what, that we were doing the right thing. We as a campaign had people all across the country. So it wasn't just like, oh, we're going to shut down Philly headquarters and for 2 weeks and come back. We had people that had been, you know, moved from one early state into a next. They were sleeping on somebody's like floor that they didn't even know, that were getting stranded in places. So the whole operations of the campaign started working quickly on how do we get people back to a home base? How do we do that safely? How do we think about what state the campaign was in? Because you sort of are SWAT teaming from place to place and really make those adjustments. And we had to get very quickly operational to be able to make these decisions, knowing that we had no idea where we were headed. And I think we worked very quickly. And then we worked very quickly once we realized this was going to be a longer haul to start rethinking how you reshape the campaign structurally and also to support the team that we had and most fundamentally make sure that the president was still able to reach the American people.
And Bruce, I want to come and bring you in here. Talk a little bit about what candidate Biden was doing all day and how nervous at all. The reporting is that he kind of leaned into this and knew that he could campaign from his home and mirror the kind of behavior that everyone else in the country was taking. But talk a little bit about what he was doing and what the thought process was there.
Well, on the one hand, it was hard for him as it was for anyone else, but especially for someone like him who thrives on social and human contact. But he got used to it, and it's an incredibly efficient way to campaign. If there were a way in future years to recreate the front porch campaign, I think future campaigns would be wise to do it. It's much less toll on everyone concerned, and you can reach a lot more people faster. But like everyone else, he was stuck at home with not very many people around, and we had to be exceptionally careful about, as Jen said, setting the right example. He wouldn't do it all over again. I think for the rest of us, we learned how to adapt.
I want to now ask a question. Maybe someone who was with the former vice president could jump in. What was then candidate Biden's reaction to George Floyd's death? Did he watch the video? What did he say when he saw it? What did it mean for him, and what he wanted to say?
I don't know. Maybe Simone, you want to couch it? He was horrified. I mean, and the whole country was. And what he really acknowledged was the fact that everyone across the world watched it in horror. And he didn't back down from it. He went and leaned into it. And I was with him when we went to Houston. And that might have been our first trip out of state or on a plane to do anything in COVID, but he thought it was important for him to be there. And I think you've seen the action since, but Simone, maybe you have a better sense of it besides my just general description that he was horrified. And, for lack of an Ivy League description, he was pissed off about it. And it was about what his whole career was about. And I was standing up for people who had been wrong. And I just, it kind of kicked us in another gear.
Simone, talk about that other gear. What not only, of course, what was his reaction? I should say Congressman Richmond just laid that out for us. But what did it mean for the campaign? What did it mean for the battle that he knew he needed to fight?
I think this really goes to the heart of what then Vice President Biden always talked about in terms of restoring the soul of this nation. If you've ever sat down and spent more than 20 minutes with Joe Biden, he has told you a story about Delaware, about the people that he knows in his community, the folks he grew up with. He's got stories for days. And this spoke so viscerally to who he was and what he believed. And he was very clear that this was important to speak out about the injustice. It was very clear that he wanted to meet this moment. It all culminated with this speech in Philadelphia. But prior to that speech, he got on the phone with the Floyd family for no other reason except to offer them his condolences, to tell them that he stood with them. It was a difficult conversation. I don't think the family expected that then Vice President Biden would pick up the phone and call them, let alone speak to them for nearly 30 minutes, asking them how they are, how they felt, how the people could support them. There were protests. I just think we have to ground ourselves in that moment. The horrific killing of George Floyd came after many videos were coming out of deaths of unarmed Black people. The George Floyd video came immediately after the Ahmaud Arbery video, where he was very horrific video. And then Vice President Biden had seen all of them. The country was seeing all of them. On top of that, there's this pandemic. On top of that, there's this president who is literally tearing at the fabric of who we are as Americans at our institutions. And I think all of this culminated in this powder keg. And what the George Floyd video was Americans saying enough. And there were protests that erupted all over the country. Then Vice President Biden went out. There were protests in Delaware, in Wilmington, Delaware. He went out into Wilmington in the aftermath of those protests to see the people.
Can you tell us about the decision to do that, to go out into Wilmington? Because it was, if I'm not mistaken, the first time other than Memorial Day that I think he went out and did an in-person event.
Yeah, Anita or Jen, I think it was a group conversation, but Joe Biden's decision.
Okay. Yeah, it was. But Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, who was one of the co-chairs of our campaign and represents Delaware and is very close to the president, and Jen, you probably have a better recollection of this, but she felt very strongly, and she called him to say, this is our city and it's hurting. So.
Yeah, and I think the thing that, you know, I would add to this is that the president felt like it was really important, and this is a theme throughout, but really critical at this time, that there was no voice of a president for this country to hear. And so while he was running for president, he had to serve in that voice for the country. And so what he said is, you know I can't travel as much or bring people together in the way I normally would. But yes, look at what's happening here in Delaware. I need to show up for that because that's happening in all of these communities across the country. And how do I do that best? By bringing people together. So it was his idea to think about how do you, we went to the local church, we brought together leaders. How do we think about that across ages and races and the community? And then, I remember it was so poignant and all Joe Biden, but he was walking around in Delaware, and you had that picture of him kneeling down with that young boy who was with his father, talking to them, and that I thought was so symbolic of the contrast in this moment that was happening in this country, that really required us all to take another look at what's going on. And he was doing it in very big ways, and also just in the natural way he engages. And while, to Bruce's point, the wear and tear of the campaign really allowed, made it a little bit easier. You saw in that too, what else he could be doing if he was able to be out there more, if there wasn't COVID. But I think we were able to take those moments all at his direction and just kind of show not just how to get through that moment, but the kind of president he would be to lead the country forward in times like that.
And we have to, oh, go ahead.
If you look at, I think it was, I'm just looking at the wall, June 2nd, I think he gave a speech on George Floyd. He opens the speech with the words of, "I can't breathe." In the first paragraph, he talks about how in America, there are people who are losing their lives just because they live in their lives. Mm-hmm. A part of that speech also references Lafayette Square, talking about how the president is brandishing a Bible and attacking peaceful protesters. Later in the speech, he raises the question saying, look, is this the country we want to be? Is this who we want to be? Mm-hmm. It was an important moment in the campaign because, look, it wasn't clear where it was going to go. And shortly thereafter, we now know that Trump went all in on a kind of law and order campaign. In the history of the country is, you could say, well, maybe from just a pure political point of view, that might have been a better bet. And Joe Biden wasn't going to have any of it. He came out, he forcefully spoke, he addressed in language that I think he did this 3 or 4 times, in language on the issue of racial justice, some of the strongest language any candidate for president has ever used. But it was at the front end, this was at the front end of what then turned into this whole debate about law and order and defunding the police and all this sort of stuff. And the president weighed in forcefully. And this, of course, around this time, and Congressman Richmond mentioned it, this was also, he had that incredible moment with George Floyd's daughter, which really stuck with him time and time again. So
we've been told to end it. We skipped over South Carolina Super Tuesday. So I'm going to end with Steve. We have to be really quick because there are students who want to ask you questions, but can you talk quickly about South Carolina Super Tuesday, when he knows he's going to win? And if you can, try to remember that there are students waiting to ask you questions after.
I'll just say that was one of the most exciting, thrilling, satisfying, fulfilling, poignant days of our lives. There's no other way to describe what South Carolina felt like, and that week afterwards. It was really, in every way, as Mike, Nita, Kate, everybody has said, Bruce, Cedric, it was just the culmination of along many years of effort. And I think every one of us, we were just thrilled that night. We had believed all along that we could get there. No one more than the president himself who believed we could get there. And so that was a great and exhilarating few days for every one of us, and something none of us will ever forget on our own. And for the president, really a vindication of everything he had worked an entire career to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And I know there are now an eager group of students who are waiting to ask you some questions.
Thanks, Yamiche. And let's bring our students forth, and let's bundle the questions at the same time in deference to everyone's time. But thank you so much to Team Biden for fascinating conversation. The student voice is always very important at the Institute of Politics. Manat Banasi is our student president. Manat.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Team Biden. So we have two questions, one from Justin, our former chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project, and one from Victor, our chair of our Fellows and Study Groups program.
Hello, thank you all for taking the time out of your day and spending it with us here at the IOP. I was wondering, a lot of credit has been given to the president and to the campaign for unifying the party ahead of the convention and going into the general election. And indeed, in our Harvard Public Opinion polls, we found that, especially with young voters of color, but also with young progressives, the former vice president, now president's approval rating really rose up in the polls. What do you credit that to, and how did the campaign go about uniting the party?
Can I say, I'll say one thing about the progressive engagement work and then yield to others, but we were extremely intentional. There were many moments throughout the primary campaign and also into the general where then Vice President Biden, in his own words, made overtures in his speeches, said, we need you. We need young people, we need progressives. But the campaign staff was also very intentional. We were extending olive branches early, talking about the ways in which where we all agree. And I think there was an agreement across the board from some of the most progressive folks in our party and maybe some of the not progressive people that we all can agree that we have to beat Donald Trump, and that Joe Biden has a message that can not only do that, but if he is elected, there are real things that we'll be able to get done. And I think the groups understood that, and that is how folks were able to rally around. So it was really a conversation about, let's talk about the things that we can agree on. We can argue about all the things that we have a difference of opinion on, but let's come together on the things that we can agree on and figure out how we can build from there. And I think that is why you saw such synergy going into a general election.
Thank you, Simone. Victor, let's hear your question.
It's truly an honor to have you all here with us today. So seeing that the Biden campaign took unique advantage of what were once primary adversaries in the development of the cabinet and in essential coalitions, how did that evolution from competitors on the primary debate stage, like the example of the vice president that you've touched on already, to trusted campaign surrogates, cabinet secretaries, and vice president, of course, occur? And was it always a part of the strategy?
So I'll just briefly say that the president, then candidate Biden, said continually through the campaign that he saw the other Democrats as competitors and his opponent was Donald Trump. And that was very much his attitude. He would talk about his colleagues. He thought they were an extraordinarily talented group of people. He liked them. We got to, and so it was a very intentional piece of ours that was driven very much by Joe Biden, who wanted a unified party, but also recognized the talented group of people that he had run against and wanted to make sure that they were part of the coalition he was building and that they were part of his government.
One of the things we saw was on March 9th, I believe, one of the things that when we were doing victory speech that night, that the president said to me that we need to be very specific about reaching out to Senator Sanders and his supporters. That we need to be recognize the contribution. We need to recognize the importance of what Senator Sanders has run on, and we need to recognize the importance of his supporters. And so he made a very, because I remember the first draft I did for him, it didn't have it in it. And he came back and said, this needs to be there. And so he was thinking early on that when the race turned in his favor, he made a very deliberate effort to say, we need to reach out and unify this party as soon as we possibly can.
I think that's because, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Secretary.
No, I was simply going to say, because in Joe Biden's world and in his mind, it's never about him. It's always about the country. It's always about other people, and that's how he's governing. But during the campaign, he never talked about I. It was always about the people and how he could help. And so it was very easy, I think, to get there with the progressives. He respected them. He wanted them to be a part of it because it was not about Joe Biden.
Congressman, I think we'll leave it that you got the last word with our thanks to the entire Biden team for a really important conversation. To our student questioners, we thank you, and most especially to Yamiche and Alex for an outstanding job. For those of you who are returning as participants or observers, the webinar will end, but you are able to please log back in on the assigned link that has already been provided to you. We'll begin the next session at 11 o'clock. Thank you all so much.